It's a bonus episode of the Book Club for Kids. Hi, I'm Kitty Felde. Last week, we discussed Beth Lincoln's tale of a family who gets its names from the dictionary. This week, we asked Beth about where the book came from.
It was quite a long process. I was part of a scheme in England through Penguin that was trying to find undiscovered writers. And so there was a long mentorship process with my editor, Ben. It was so long, in fact, it was, I think, 2 years longer than it was supposed to last because I kept getting distracted with lots of things. I kind of had convinced myself that it was never going to be a real book. And then I think when it really sunk in was when I saw Claire Powell's illustrations. And it was like, oh, someone else has been contacted and contracted and paid to draw something from in my head and done it really well. Like her illustrations are beautiful. And that was when it started to feel real. And then going into a bookshop, I think, where was the place? Oh, sorry. I know I ramble a little. I went on an American West Coast brief tour last year before I went to Seattle. I got the ferry at like 5 a.m. over to San Francisco from Petaluma, where I was staying. First bookshop I walked into, my book was there on the shelf. And that was the weirdest moment to have come, you know, thousands of miles to from England to San Francisco and to walk into a bookshop and, oh, look, there's my book. Wild.
Beth, do you notice any difference between the way the book is received in the U.S. versus Great Britain?
They're very different. I think even if you look at the difference in the covers, the American edition and the UK edition are completely different colour scheme-wise. The culture is completely different. What I will say that I found is that I love doing school visits in America because American kids don't have that stiff upper lip British thing of not speaking. American kids will put their hand up, they'll offer suggestions, they'll be rowdy. They're like, and I love that. That's brilliant when you were doing a school visit. Because a lot of my kind of school visits I do are interactive. And I desperately want people to engage with me and yell out stuff. And that's fantastic. I think kids here are a little bit shyer, but reading habits, I think, are definitely very, very different. We have a much smaller market in some ways compared to you guys. I walked into a Barnes & Noble there and I was like, oh my gosh, this is a warehouse. How do you find everything? You know, all your bookshops aren't tucked away down teeny tiny little snickle ways in like a 700-year-old city or whatever. Yeah.
How difficult was it for you to find your people, other writers, particularly because you're not based in London, but in the northern part of England?
I was quite lucky because there was a group chat started up on X, formerly known as Twitter, where all of the debuts in middle grade and lower, all the debut writers, created a big group chat together so that we could all support each other and plug each other's books and talk and stuff. And that was really, really lovely and eye-opening. I will say that there's not a lot of writers that are based in the north just because the publishing is all based in the south. So it can be a little bit isolating sometimes trying to find your people.
You also write for grown-ups, so what's the difference between writing for that older audience versus writing for kids?
Number one, I think it's more difficult. I think it is more difficult to remember the audience that you're writing for and to make sure that you are occupying a space where you're not talking down to a kid, but also that you're not expecting way too much of them as a reader. And that is such a fine line to walk, and it's so, so difficult to do. Even things like, you know, this is a book that's largely about words and about stretching your vocabulary, like finding that kind of sweet spot between putting in words that a kid won't necessarily have come across before, or taking things out because you're like, that's a little bit of a stretch too far, or that's a concept that would take too long to like explain. I find that quite hard, but also I think it's one of the more rewarding things because it forces you in a way to think so much more deeply about your audience and to anticipate the interaction between the reader and the book in a different way than writing for adults, which to me feels a little bit more like I am making my thing, and if you don't like it, you don't like it. Like I'm not saying that I would necessarily shape my decisions for a children's novel completely around what I think a kid would like or not like, but I take them into account a lot more, if that makes sense.
You mentioned that you had a technique for balancing several writing projects at the same time. Care to share?
I always think about it as terms of I have like a million tabs open in my brain. And so what I actually find is that having more than one thing to focus on creatively means that it spurs me on. So it's like, oh, I really want to work on this other thing, so I'm going to really focus on this thing and push at that. And then when I get bored of that thing, well, I can switch over to this thing. I think it's no coincidence that I handed in my second off last round of edits 4 days ago for book 2. And I am immediately super psyched about working on this fantasy novel that I've been thinking about.
Thanks, Beth. We have interviews with dozens of other writers at our website, bookclubforkids.org, on our Writers on Writing page. This episode is supported in part by the LA County Department of Arts and Culture as part of Creative Recovery LA, an initiative funded by the American Rescue Plan. Thank you. I'm Kitty Felde. Thanks so much for listening.